And as we head into our passage for this morning, I'm reminded of a certain quality within Jesus that seems to be a trigger for a lot of the action in his life. And it's the simple idea of compassion. That compassion is the quality that often leads Jesus to action. You know, there's 4 authors in the New Testament of the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that all tell the story of who Jesus is. And as you read through them, there's a phrase that comes off quite often as the authors are describing these different moments. And it's simply this: Jesus had compassion on them, so he. Or Jesus had compassion on them, and he. And it's his compassion that becomes this trigger for the things that he does. And compassion is an incredible thing. It changes the course of lives. And here's what I love about compassion. It inspires action that otherwise would not exist. It causes us to operate, to treat people in a certain way that with the absence of compassion, it just wouldn't be there. You know, so yesterday afternoon, I had the chance to go bouldering. Anyone know what bouldering is? It's fine if you don't. It's a fairly obscure sport. It's like indoor rock climbing. And so I went with a couple of dads from church here, and we took our sons along, and we were enjoying an afternoon climbing. And there was this one little moment between Isaac, one of the guys that we went with, and his little son, Henry. And I actually just want to show you an image of that photo there. And that's Henry learning to climb this wall. Actually, shortly after that, Isaac helped me get up that same wall with a similar, just kind of helping me out there. And I love this picture both of fatherhood and a heart of compassion towards a child. That Henry in his own strength wasn't able to climb up that particular wall. Very soon he's going to be able to. But in that moment, he needed a little something extra. So his dad was able to pay the balance of strength that Henry was missing to climb up that wall. And that's what compassion does. It actually allows us to bring strength to others, to pay the thing that is missing by applying our own heart and strength. Now, for all of us that are parents, we understand this on a daily level, what it means to respond to compassion towards our children. But compassion shows up in so many different arenas of life. Or perhaps if you're like me, sometimes the lack of compassion. So one of the things that Jesus understood is how to live a life of compassion, how to bring strength to others. And from that kind of foundation of understanding who Christ is, I want to take us this morning to one of the most famous and told and retold stories from the gospel. Each of our gospel authors all tell this same story, where Jesus miraculously is able to feed 5,000 people. And many of you would have heard this story many times. Some of you, you'll be hearing it for the first time this morning. So Jesus feeds 5,000. But where it begins is a response of compassion. So over the last couple of weeks, we've been noting a character called John the Baptist, who kind of comes in and out of Jesus' story from when he's a child to his baptism, and then later on, tragically, in John's death. Now, John the Baptist and Jesus had this special connection and understanding. And it's probably a fair statement that John knew Jesus and understood Jesus in a way that no other human being did. He understood who he was. He understood the calling that he had. And when John the Baptist was killed in an unjust way, it hit the heart of Jesus. There was grief and there was pain. And the story of the feeding of the 5,000 actually begins with this moment. And so I want to read to us the first couple of verses here. We're going to begin in verse 12. So John's disciples, and this is after the death of John the Baptist, and we're in Matthew 14, sorry. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. And let's look at the initial response of Jesus to this tragic news. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Then hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So I really resonate with Jesus in this moment. And this is one of the great stories of the New Testament where we really can see the humanness of Jesus. Because he experiences this incredible hardship in the form of the loss of his friend. And his response is to withdraw. He takes his disciples, they go to a quiet place, and they just want to deal and process this tragic thing that's happened. And for me, that's kind of how I respond to these situations. When I'm experiencing any kind of pain or hardship, my tendency is to kind of withdraw, to kind of step back from responsibilities. Anyone else like that? That's kind of a human response to that kind of pain for me. And I see Jesus doing the exact same thing that I would do in that moment. I'm encouraged by that. But the crowds, they see. There's a huge amount of excitement about Jesus. At this point in his ministry, he's miraculously healing the sick. He's teaching about God's kingdom and teaching fullness of life in a way that they've never encountered. So everywhere he goes, great crowds of people gather. And as they retreat to this quiet place, the crowds get wind of it. And it's almost like they're there waiting for them. Now, it's important to understand the emotion of Jesus and the disciples. Because if it was me, after having retreated out of this time of pain and distress, and then all these people are here, my reaction would not be a good one. I'd be trying to put in my AirPods and just pretend like the people were not there. Be saying, nope, I've got nothing left. I'm fried. I've got nothing in the tank. And the need in front of me would become invisible. Now, you might feel a little bit like me in that moment. That's how I'd be feeling, if I'm really honest, if I put my feet into the shoes of Jesus, maybe the sandals of Jesus. My response would be trying to get away. Okay, let's reset, let's go again, we'll find another quiet place. This one's not doing it. But Jesus doesn't respond in that way. He doesn't allow his hardship to choke his compassion. And here's one of the questions that I have for myself as I step into this passage of Scripture, and a question I invite you to begin wrestling with as well, is do we allow a hardship to choke away our compassion? Because I think it can be a normal response. And part of it's because when I'm experiencing pain, I'm less willing to take responsibility for somebody else's need. I'm just trying to be as honest as I can. That I'm less prepared to do that because I'm more focused on the deficit in my own life. But what's so wonderful about this story from the life of Jesus is that he responds in a very different way. So in verse 14, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, I've described how I'd respond in that moment. Here's how he responds. And here's our phrase. He had compassion on them. And his compassion allows action to take place that otherwise could not exist. He healed their sick. In Mark's version of this story, he adds that he healed the sick. He also taught them about the goodness of who God is. And you get this picture across the different accounts of this story that Jesus and the disciples spent many hours ministering to the needs of the people. Then in verse 15, the disciples, remembering they're all a part of this as well, and they're probably responding a little bit more like I would in this moment. And they're exhausted. They're tired. Jesus, this has been going on a while. It's past dinner time. And the disciples respond in this way. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late, Jesus. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves food." So the disciples, they're done. The day's ministry, they are just at their limit. And they say, Jesus, quite literally, Jesus has been performing miracles. The kind of miracles they're not referenced, but it's likely he was doing things like setting people free from blindness. These were the kind of miracles that he was doing up to this point, the reason crowds were gathering. Incredible, miraculous things. So literally the response of the disciples is to say, Jesus, enough miracles. We've seen enough miraculous healings for the afternoon. We're tired and we want to chill out. You've made enough lame people walk. You've opened enough eyes. You've set enough people free. Just tell them to go home. We're done. Now, Jesus is responding with compassion. The disciples have got some other things going on. Probably doing better than I would have in that moment. But Jesus wants to show them what compassion is. So if the evidence of compassion in us is action that otherwise would not exist, where can compassion make a difference in our lives today? So we see the difference between Jesus and the disciples. He's like, yep, bring them. The disciples, send them away. So what would actually happen in my life if I was injected with the compassion of Jesus? What are some of the spaces in your life that would be different if you were able to respond more with compassion? You know, I showed you an image just capturing parenthood. You know, so much of what it means to be a mum or dad. And I'm so grateful for all the young families here this morning, all the mums and dads. What would it look like to demonstrate more compassion towards our children? Some of us are married or in relationships. What would it look like if we had more compassion towards our partners, towards our husbands and wives? Some of you are employers. Some of you are running businesses. Some of you are leading teams. What would it look like to demonstrate more of the compassion of Christ as you lead with strength in the role that you have? What about someone with a different theological perspective or a different political leaning? What would it look like to step into those conversations with compassion? And even as I've listed some of those spaces or examples, there might be some arenas where you're like, yeah, I think I could benefit from a little more of the compassion that Jesus is displaying here. And often it's when we're facing a bit of pain that it becomes most hard. Again, for those of us with young kids, it's amazing. I remember when our kids were small, kind of at the start of the day, it's pretty easy to be compassionate towards the foibles of toddlers. You go for 12 hours, you're doing really, really good. And that last half an hour, when the emotional tanks are a little bit lower, you've been responding with compassion all day, and then that last half an hour, the emotional energy's low, the frustration's high, and that's where the uncompassionate response comes. I remember having that experience so many times as a dad. I've done 98% of this day so well. The last 2%, I struggled. And then you can process that, talk that through, come up with ways to finish the day better. But again, it's this picture of it's easy to respond with compassion when it's easy. It's hard when it's hard. And this story, at its bones, is a story of responding with compassion when it's not particularly easy. So here's how Jesus responds to the disciples. And here's the encouragement of the passage to each one of us today. In verse 16, Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." And this is where it starts turning in a kind of miraculous direction. It says, you give them something to eat. And the disciples, remember they're completely fried. They've been ministering all day. They're dealing with the grief of the loss of their friend. Like, how can we possibly do that, Jesus? It's 5,000 people gathered here. And in verse 17, they say, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And we learn from John's version of this story that it's a child that actually brings an offering, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It says, here's what I have. And perhaps, and most likely, the child was thinking, I can give this as a blessing to Jesus and the disciples. And so the disciples say, this is all we have, Jesus. We've got 5 loaves. There's 5,000 people here. We're short 4,995. This isn't going to work. And then Jesus says, bring them here to me. Bring the 5 that you have to me. I think in this part of the story, there's a wrestle around responsibility. Now, I think there's a really powerful link between compassion and the willingness to take responsibility for a need. So I think really what true compassion is when we're actually moved to take responsibility for the need that we see in front of us. And one of the things that kills our capacity to take responsibility for brokenness is when it feels hopeless. Have you ever felt that way? And it could be around all kinds of things. It could be around, taking care of our environment. The small thing we can do, no matter how good a job we do, it just feels like a little water pistol putting out a bushfire. Or whatever the need is that you're passionate about, that your heart's drawn to. Sometimes it can just feel hopeless. And hopelessness can break compassion. When the need is 5,000 and we have 5, one of the options is that we say, I've only got 5. What difference does it make? And we can give in to despair. I remember many years ago in my life when I was working as a chaplain in a local high school, there was this particular student who was growing up in just a pretty broken situation at home. And I remember as a young man trying to be positive somehow in this particular student's life. And there was a support team at the school, and we were kind of doing everything we could. And pretty early on, it came to my, realization that no matter what I do between the hours of 9 and 3, this student's going home into the same brokenness every single day. I remember as a young man, just that clicked for me. And I just felt really, really hopeless. And at the time, I worked with this incredible psychologist. She wasn't a Christian, didn't have any sense of who Jesus was. And I remember this conversation that I had with her as a young guy, just overwhelmed and just a little bit, depressed by the situation and the hopelessness. And I remember her saying to me, no, and she used this kind of illustration about light and dark. She said, no matter how much darkness is in someone's life, you can always bring a little bit of light. And I said, are you sure you're not a Christian? And she's like, no, definitely not. That sounded awful Jesus-y to me. And she just told me to be quiet. But I remember taking hold of that encouragement. And she just said, you got 5 minutes with this student each day. What kind of a difference can you make? And I thought about that. I was like, the need in that person's life is 5,000. I've got 5 to bring. So one of the choices that I made is that every day when I was at school, I was just going to find this student and say hi. Literally all I had. I was going to say hi, tell them they're awesome, and that's all I had. And I did that over time. And that student eventually graduated. And I kind of didn't think of them for several years. And then many years later after that, I was speaking at a school assembly. And a young EA came up to me, an educational assistant, and it happened to be this student that I'd known all these years ago. I was like, oh, it's you. And she said, thank you for responding like that every time you saw me when I was in high school. That's all I had. Oh, it's you. Good to see you. Have a great day. She said, thank you for your kindness. That meant so much. And I just was reminded of that. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I'm like, this person has overwhelming need that I can't possibly solve. But I just did that little thing. I just brought my 5, even though the need was 5,000. And it made a difference. So one of the things that I think we need to learn to do is to just bring our 5. Just bring our 5 to whatever it is. To the life of your kids, just bring your 5. When it comes to your marriages, just keep bringing your 5. If you're passionate about the things of God and seeing Jesus make a difference in people's lives, just keep bringing your 5. Don't give in to despair. Say, if I've got 5 to bring, I'm going to bring my 5. But here's the good news about this story. That we have the opportunity not to just give our five, but we have the opportunity to give our five care of Jesus. And when we give our five through Christ, something else begins to happen. And that's fundamentally what this story is about. When we're moved by compassion in our own hearts to bring our five through Jesus, the story changes. Let's read again the final parts of this passage. In verse 19, Jesus, he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven. Here's what I love about this picture. So for me, when I'm facing these kind of challenges, sometimes my eyes look down to, again, the missing 4,995. Jesus' eyes don't look down. His eyes look up to heaven. To say, I've got 5, but I'm going to give my 5 with my eyes set on who Jesus is. He gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And this is a key part of this story, that it isn't Jesus that hands out this miraculous provision of bread and fish. It's the disciples. The disciples give what they have, but Jesus has just fundamentally changed what they have to give. But it's still them that do the work of giving. Gave them to the people, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. And with some imagination, it's easy to perhaps conclude that Jesus wanted the 12 of them to know the power of provision in Jesus. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides the women and children, so much higher than 5,000. Now, when John tells this story, he includes a detail that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not. And right at the start, I think it's in verse 9. I don't have the verse, but you can look it up. He says, and he reminds us that it's Passover time. So for John, it was an important detail for us to remember as readers that this moment of miraculous provision and Jesus meeting this need of bread, of food. John reminds us that this is Passover time. And that's really significant because what the Passover was a celebration of God's provision for his people coming out of slavery in Egypt. And Moses was the leader of God's people. He led them out of captivity through the miraculous power of God. And as they left Egypt, they began a life in the wilderness. And in the wilderness, something that's really important was that God provided for them. He provided for their needs. And each morning, there was a miraculous provision of bread called manna. Some of you remember this story. And this was all part of the history of the people that Jesus was talking to. So they all had this as a point of reference in their mind. And I think John wants us to have it as a point of reference in our mind as well. That God is provision. That Jesus is provision. And then a little later at the end of John's version of this story, he says that the crowd wanted to make him king. The crowd believed that he was that prophet that Moses talked about in Deuteronomy, that a prophet will come again from amongst your own people. They were starting to see who Jesus was. John says it was a sign of who he was as the Messiah. That Jesus is the provider. And when we think about the work of compassion through us, we've got to remember that it begins with what Jesus has first done for us. That the cross is a picture of the compassion of God towards each one of us. And in a few moments, we're going to get the opportunity to take and share in something called communion. And if you're new to church, this is a small symbolic meal that Jesus later at the time of Passover, he had a meal with his disciples. They had bread and a cup of wine that was a symbol of what Jesus would do upon the cross, his provision for them on the cross. So we take the little cup to remember that God has compassion towards my life. We take the little cracker to remember that Jesus sees who I am and is compassionate towards me. And we're going to take that shared meal together in a few moments' time. But as we do that, here's the wonderful thing about compassion. That when we allow compassion to make a difference in our lives, it actually allows us to demonstrate to others who Jesus is. Compassion is the action within us that reveals Jesus, I think most powerfully to others. That when we're able to respond with compassion, what we're actually doing is responding like Jesus did. So as we finish our time this morning, I want to encourage you to ask yourself the question, what does compassion require of you? If compassion's to be alive in me, what new action needs to take shape in my life? There might be a particular arena of your life, a particular relationship, a certain challenge, where perhaps this morning you've been challenged or encouraged by this story of Jesus. Say, I'm going to lead and respond with a bit more compassion than I thought was possible. And I know it's hard. Jesus knows it's hard. That's why we have this story. But to show compassion through hardship is who Jesus is and who he invites us to be. And as we do that, as we take on that challenge from Jesus, we're reminded that he chose the cross for each one of us. The ultimate act of compassion towards us. Enduring the ultimate hardship for each one of us. I invite the team to come back and join me, and they're going to lead us into a time of communion. So if you're new to church, new to communion, kind of describe that. And what we'd like to do here as the team leads through a song is we have some tables around the place. So we'd just like to invite you to come from where you are to the table and just take that cup, take that cracker, and remember that this is a symbolic meal, recognizing what Jesus has done for us. And invite you to do that, even if you're still forming your own sense of faith and who God is, who Jesus is. And just participate in this meal with an open heart and say, God, if you're there, if there's really hope for my life in you, would you show me more and more? I'd love to pray for us, and then we're going to share in communion together.